Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this lecture series on lessons not learned from the Holocaust. My name is Mika Ahuvia, and I'm the Marcia and Jay Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies here at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. As Curriculum Chair for Jewish Studies, I'm facilitating this lecture series with experts from all over campus and running this as a class. I just want to acknowledge that the University of Washington sits on the occupied homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. My family and I are grateful to live and work as guests on these lands, and this land acknowledgement is but one small gesture in the ongoing process of working towards repairing and sustaining relations with Coast Salish lands, waters, peoples, and their other than human kin. Today's speaker is Senior Lecturer Rick Lorenz. Frederick Lorenz grew up in New York City and obtained his undergraduate and law degrees from Marquette University. He served a career in the U.S. Marine Corps as a judge advocate, retiring as colonel in 1998. He obtained an LLM with highest honors from George Washington University in land use management and control, and practiced environmental land use law between 1982 and 1991. In 1992, he was the senior legal advisor for the United Nations authorized military intervention in Somalia. In 1996, he served in Bosnia as a senior legal advisor for the NATO Implementation Force and went on to teach political science at the National Defense University. In 1998, he spent a year as a Fulbright senior scholar in St. Petersburg, Russia, teaching courses in international law, environmental law, and U.S. foreign policy. In 2000, he served as the United Nations Legal Affairs Officer in Kosovo, working in the UN Civil Administration. Since then, he has consulted for the U.S. State Department on more than a dozen assignments in 3 continents. He is currently a senior lecturer at the Jackson School of International Studies at UW and adjunct senior lecturer at the School of Law. His courses include Water and Security in the Middle East and International Humanitarian Law, which is the law of armed conflict. We're so pleased that he has joined us in this lecture series. His lecture today is titled Genocide in Myanmar, the Case Before the International Court of Justice.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frederick Lorenz. I'm a senior lecturer at the Jackson School of International Studies. And today I'm going to be making a presentation about genocide in Myanmar and the International Court of Justice. So this presentation is one that I give in my class, The International Humanitarian Law. It's a fascinating look at the current situation in Myanmar and some of the terrible violence and crimes that have been committed there. Myanmar has a fascinating history. Rudyard Kipling wrote about it. In the 1800s, it was under British rule, and a large population from India and Chinese traders came. During World War II, Japanese occupied Burma until they drove out the British and declared independence. However, Burma eventually switched back to the Allies to help drive out the Japanese. But military rule has been a significant part of life in Myanmar for more than 100 years. In 1988, violence began to occur between pro-democracy demonstrators and the military, resulting in thousands of deaths. In the National League for Democracy, Myanmar's longtime opposition party returned to the formal political process with a landslide victory in 2015 and gave it a majority. And nevertheless, the military continued to dominate Myanmar. The military junta was in power between 1962 and 2011. It was responsible for major human rights abuses against the many ethnic and religious minority groups that are present, including Rohingya Muslim and the Christian Karen. But Myanmar is mostly a Buddhist nation. The government transferred to civilian control in 2011, but again, the military maintains significant power and human rights abuses continue. It's important to look at China's increasing role in the region. And the military leadership is tied directly into economic development. And Myanmar has a serious problem with corruption. It seems to flourish in every sector of government and business. Transparency's International Corruption Index recently ranked Myanmar 130th out of the 180 countries that they reviewed. And the link between China and Myanmar will complicate any international efforts to deal with the violence. Here's a map that shows Chinese plans for a major oil and gas pipeline, a copper mine, dams, and China certainly considers it part of its long-term objectives in extending its influence around the world. Ethnic groups in Myanmar, very complicated. Here's a map from Al Jazeera, which attempts to lay that out in the shape of the country. The majority, again, are Buddhist, but there are dozens of minorities that are put in states. Many of the states are considered ethnic minority states. And you can look, the Karen is a Christian group, and the Rakhine state in the lower left corner is the one where most of the violence has been occurring with the Rohingya Muslims. A complex and difficult map. 135 ethnic groups are in there, but the Rohingya have been particularly singled out and stripped of their citizenship. In 2017, the violence against the Rohingya seemed to reach the worst level. And there was a small band of Rohingya militants which began a violent action against the government. And that produced a massive retaliation from the government. And over 675,000 Rohingya fled the country in just 3 months, moving west into Bangladesh. Another factor, rape has been used extensively against the Rohingya women and girls. Gang rapes, mass rapes have been committed prior to and during major attacks. The current situation in Myanmar is that more than 600,000, the exact number I'm not sure, live in the Rakhine state, and they're under threat of violence. And Bangladesh has indicated it will take no more refugees and will encourage the Rohingya living in Bangladesh to return to the Rakhine state voluntarily. The displaced Rohingya are essentially stateless, with no country granting or recognizing basic rights of citizenship. So this map shows where a large percentage of the Rohingya that fled the violence went. In Bangladesh, you see in the center of the map, Cox's Bazar is that name of the massive camps that were pictured in that previous location, and Rakhine State is in red. And the individual, they've left their homeland, and they're living in miserable conditions in the edge of Bangladesh. So let's talk about genocide for a minute. The word was first coined by Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944 in his book. And the Greek prefix genus, meaning race or tribe, and the Latin suffix "cide," meaning killing. Lemkin developed the term partly in response to the Nazi policies of murder of Jewish people during the Holocaust, but also in response to previous instances in history of targeted actions aimed at the destruction of particular groups of people. Now let's go to Nuremberg for a minute. Special conditions here, the end of the Great War, when the Nazi perpetrators were in the hands of the victorious Allies. Some describe this as victor's justice. But the Nazis had documented their crimes, and of course we all know that the Holocaust crimes were a big part of these trials. And if you look at the crimes that the main perpetrators were convicted of, most of them sitting there, it was crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. You'll note that the term genocide was not used at that time. In fact, the crime of genocide had not yet been defined under the law. And under the Nuremberg Tribunal, nevertheless, convicted the defendants of acts that would today be recognized as genocide, although at that time they were really recognized as war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the Nuremberg was really the first major case of individual criminal responsibility under international law, and that legacy still remains. So the Genocide Convention, 1949, 150 states have ratified. It's widely ratified, and it would be fair to say that it is, at least on its face, it appears to be rather specific in terms of its term. And that it means that the acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And now these are ways or acts of committing genocide: killing, causing serious bodily injury, deliberately inflicting conditions of life to bring about destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, or forcible transfer of children. These were the specific acts listed in the Genocide Convention. More importantly, the action-forcing provisions of the Genocide Convention were created to not only define genocide, but also to require the states, the parties to the convention, to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. And that include, they must pass their own legislation, and whoever they are, under Article 4. And finally, the obligation really is considered customary law. So under this theory of international law, even states that have not ratified the convention, that law still exists, and they become norms of international law. And in theory, all states, whether they have ratified the Genocide Convention or not, should be obligated to comply. So let's talk about the history and what do we have in terms of the enforcement of the Genocide Convention over the past 50 years. In short, there's been limited success in enforcing the Genocide Convention. There was only one civil case, that's a case between states, that has handled the Genocide Convention, and that really was the one regarding Bosnia and the Bosnian city of Srebrenica, which is the photo behind here. And Bosnian Serb forces killed nearly 8,000 men and boys in 1995. They found it was genocide, but they did not find that Serbia was responsible. Again, this was a civil case, not looking at individual criminal liability, but looking at state responsibility. So the one civil case that's involved the Genocide Convention has really had inconclusive results. Criminal cases, there have been some results, positive results, of convictions for genocide. And those were primarily at the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal, both international tribunals convened in the 1990s. And the first conviction for genocide as a crime, an individual crime, was one at the Rwanda Tribunal in 1998. And so I suppose it's a fair question to ask, the Genocide Convention was passed in 1949, but there was no criminal conviction for genocide until 1998. You can say that there's been about 14 individuals who have been convicted and sentenced for the crime of genocide, and those were principally at the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal. The situation in Darfur was particularly serious, and the Hassan al-Bashir was indicted at the International Criminal Court, although he was not turned over. And if you think the acts in Darfur, the genocidal acts in Darfur were occurring as early as 2004, 2005, he was not indicted until 2009. And although he's been removed from office in the last year or two, he has not been turned over to the court. So I would say the enforcement of the Genocide Convention looking back since it was created, the results have been mixed. Now let's get back to Myanmar, and here you see a fascinating photo of it would be President Obama and our then Secretary of State with the newly elected leader of Myanmar in a very optimistic time. And in 2012, before the transfer to civilian rule, there were attempts to put economic sanctions on Myanmar. But then the Obama administration rolled back the sanctions in 2016 after Aung San Suu Kyi won the election as a good faith gesture recognizing the country's path to democracy. So that photo you see there certainly seems to indicate a high watermark in relationship with the new democratically elected leader of Myanmar and the world community. By 2018, things had turned again with the 2017 violence. And the State Department described the military's actions as extreme, large-scale, widespread actions, but still did not use the term genocide. Again, there can be crimes committed, there can be ethnic cleansing, but the international community sometimes tries to avoid the use of the G word, the genocide word, because that would imply that there is a requirement to take action under the action forcing provisions of the statute. So back to the leader. I'm not sure I can pronounce her name correctly, Aung San Suu Kyi. And she is recently, before the International Court of Justice, she acknowledged that there may have been disproportionate force, even in disregard of international humanitarian law, but it seems justified because of the coordinated and comprehensive attacks against the government by the militants. So the Aung San Suu Kyi's response and her statements have really turned much of the world against her and against Myanmar. And the awards that she had received, including the Holocaust Memorial Museum Award, the Elie Wiesel Award, which she was presented in 2012, they literally withdrew the award. She had also received the Nobel Peace Prize, and 400,000 people called on the Nobel Committee to rescind her Peace Prize. And despite that international outcry, the chair of the Nobel Committee said it was not possible to retract the award. So what about the facts? There were a number of investigations in terms of to try to find out exactly what's happening on the ground. There was the independent fact-finding mission in 2018. And there was a finding that the conditions led to killings, rapes, gang rapes, torture, forced displacement, and other grave rights violation. And that prompted the 700,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh in 2017, and they are substantially all still there, having been ethnically cleansed from their own country. The IFFM did not specifically conclude the issue of genocide, but of course that could be implied from the facts that were found in that investigation. So many challenges in dealing with the problem. How do you deal with this level of violence? And despite the condemnation from the international community, the citizens, certainly the Burmese majority, seem to support the government's lack of response to this. The Myanmar people, many of them, perhaps even a majority, see the Rohingya as illegal immigrants and refer to them as Bengalis, not Rohingya. And there seems to be overwhelming support of Aung San Suu Kyi, and they generally believe that the international community is using false information on the violence in Rakhine State. A sad situation. Social media, we can't neglect this. You know, when you look back at the conditions in Germany, or the condition during the Holocaust, I mean, the incitement, the actions were perpetrated by the German government, but here, a new factor that makes it extraordinarily difficult is social media is whipping up a frenzy against these people. It didn't exist back then. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg told U.S. senators that the social media is trying to deal with this by hiring Burmese speakers, but apparently there were 100,000 examples of hate speech, and the question is, how many people does Facebook have to hire, and how do you tamp down that level of incitement to violence? Another issue we have today in dealing with violence that in some ways makes it more difficult to deal with this serious problem. Look at some of the horrible language used here that was used in an army-controlled publication about this. And this army-controlled publication talks about destroying the race. As we'll find out, this could be evidence, I think, of genocide by an army-controlled publication. And so what about prospects for accountability in a criminal court? The International Criminal Court, I won't talk about it too much, but it's in The Hague, and it's got many difficulties. It was founded in 1998, the Rome Statute. It became operating in 2002, but it has had only a handful of convictions and many, many obstacles. This is their new court building in the Netherlands. And Myanmar is not a state party to the International Criminal Court, but still the court has ruled that it may investigate and could bring charges, because in Bangladesh, the victims are in Bangladesh, and therefore the court would have jurisdiction. But given the limited ICC resources and capacity, the fact that Myanmar will not cooperate, I would say the impact of the ruling, the international court ruling, is minimal. I think it's unlikely that the ICC dealing with this could bring any accountability for the crimes that are being committed in Myanmar. The International Court of Justice, it's the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, located in The Hague. I was fortunate to bring students there from the University of Washington for I think 8 years in a row, and a fascinating place. And its primary functions are to settle international legal disputes between states and to give advisory opinions to the United Nations. The Gambia, the country is an African country, a Muslim majority country, also a party to the Genocide Convention, and it has claimed and taken standing at the court to resolve a dispute on the Genocide Convention, and therefore it's been able to successfully bring this case of alleged genocide to the International Court of Justice. Gambia claim, quite fascinating, and it is arguing under the statute that Myanmar must cease any acts that violate the convention. In other words, stop committing acts of genocide, and also implement its obligations to prevent genocide. Myanmar is asked to hold individuals who act in violation criminally accountable within the Myanmar system. And I've said many times that if any system is to be effective, it has to be the state, the national systems. International courts, in a best case, are only going to be able to handle a minimal number of cases. And Gambia also requested in this recent case that the court rule on provisional measures designed to protect the Rohingya while these legal questions are being considered. And so in January 23rd of this year, the International Court of Justice issued a ruling. It said, number one, we have jurisdiction for provisional measures. The court held that Myanmar must take steps to prevent further genocidal acts by groups or forces acting under its control. And it required Myanmar to submit a report within 4 months. And in fact, Myanmar has done that at the end of May this year. Myanmar has submitted a lengthy report, but it's not clear if Myanmar's response about what it's doing about this, it's not clear whether this has had any impact or whether it's going to have any impact on the ground or on the rulings of the court. When I saw this picture, I was preparing for my class in May, I realized, wait a minute, sitting in the right of that picture, that's William Chavez, my colleague from Galway, Ireland, who hosted me as a visiting scholar at the Irish Center for Human Rights. I would say that he's one of the leading scholars on international court matters. And here he is defending Myanmar in the case of genocide. And so it's fascinating to see how a great scholar, in a sense, is he a genocide denier? What is the theory about this? So I think it's important to understand some of the legal issues here. And this is Chavez's theory on this. And he believes that if you have an extended debate over the term genocide, it's often counterproductive. And using, if you keep claiming genocide, it is a way to get media attention, but it might delay effective action in dealing with the problem. And the debate often overlooks the older and well-recognized concept of crimes against humanity. You recall the Nuremberg trials convicted the Nazis of crimes against humanity, and that included the acts during the Holocaust. They were convicted, and that crime is in place. That crime can be used in the International Criminal Court. And so, and it doesn't require this specific intent. And it's interesting. So Chavez helped defend this case in the International Court of Justice. And he said, there really is not enough showing that the government of Myanmar specifically intended to destroy these people. It was an insurgency. There's not enough. It's an interesting opinion. He's taken a lot of criticism for that, and it was a legal opinion, but I think there's some points to be made, and I would recommend his book, Unimaginable Atrocities, available at Oxford University Press. It was printed in 2012. And so the Security Council. Well, the Security Council has the power to deal with this and to use all necessary means under its Chapter 7 provisions. But China is essentially supporting Myanmar on this. We know the economic interests that China has in Myanmar, and so that is certainly a weak part of the international community. And it's fair to say that international law is difficult to enforce against states with powerful political allies, particularly when that country, like China, has veto power in the United Nations, a big challenge. And so let's just summarize the challenges. This particular case, the ICJ case, it has to submit a formal memorial or a pleading in July. Myanmar must respond. There's not yet been a determination that Myanmar has committed genocide. That ruling is probably years away. There's no formal compliance mechanism and no police or peacekeepers. And really, it does require the cooperation of concerned states. And I don't think we're moving ahead on that. So in summary, my conclusions: the Genocide Convention really has not fulfilled the promise of the original signatories. It'll take more than the actions of international court to stop these criminal acts, whatever they were, genocide or crimes against humanity. Military intervention, not going to happen under the current international regime. Highly unlikely. Social media is a new factor that has to be considered when that seems to be a main contributor to the violence. How to impact that, I'm not sure. looking for some hope. Perhaps a new U.S. administration can help muster the international political will to deal with the problem. So that's all I have on this presentation, and I'm looking forward to handling your questions later on. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Hey, thank you all, and welcome back to the live portion of this event. Thank you, Dr. Lorenz, for this wonderful presentation. So I'm going to start with a question from students in the course, and everyone else, please feel free to use the Q&A box below to use your to submit your question. So the student writes, I found this lecture very informative, and it made me stop and think about what's happening in the world today. The thing that stood out the most to me was his conclusion, where he stated that the Genocide Convention of 1949 has not fulfilled the promise of the original signatories. I find this very disheartening because the point of the Genocide Convention was to prevent actions and events like the Holocaust, and yet they're still happening today, as we see in Myanmar. Since classifying Myanmar as genocidal is incurring complications, why aren't we charging Myanmar with crimes against humanity? Why did we stop using the term crimes against humanity?
Well, I think a number of reasons that even if we focus on crimes against humanity, the courtroom solutions really are not going to be available. And I think remember the case before the International Court of Justice is only under the Genocide Convention. And so that means that the only options they have is, do you find genocide or not? Do you make provisional orders? And I guess the point was that courts don't seem to be the principal way of dealing with this. I think that the way the Genocide Convention was designed, it wasn't designed only to result in court rulings, which can take years. I think it was designed to identify the crime and to force action on behalf of the states to deal with it. And our current international system doesn't seem to be very well equipped to respond to this type of crime. So I think that's my take on it.
Another short question from a student. I hope this is a short question. What other cases of genocide do you think are still present today?
Sure. Well, you know, I think the if you look worldwide, there's the Myanmar is the one that's gotten the most attention. If you look at in many places, there's violence on a mass scale. In fact, if you look at the rulings of the International Criminal Court, they found in Kenya, for example, they found crimes against humanity, mass scale, and and that was a post-election violence. It was difficult to prove that there was an intent to destroy a particular group. And by the way, political groups cannot be the subject of a genocide crime. If you look, interestingly enough, the genocide crime was defined as ethnic, religious, but not political. And so some people would like to broaden the concept of who can be covered under genocide. But I have to say that Chavez's point that if we focus so much on the legal definition of genocide and we ignore the problems on the ground and the political means and military means of dealing with them, then that's the problem.
Yeah, I see another audience member, right, has asked about your colleague Chavez, right? You said also your friend. I mean, have you spoken with him ever? Like, how does he?
Well, you know, I was fortunate in my May class, after I realized that he was part of this case, he came in and lectured in my spring course in international humanitarian law from London, and he covered this in detail. And again, I think his position would be, in no way do I condone these crimes that are being committed there. It's just that the Genocide Convention does not seem to be a way to deal with them. And he felt that it's a fascinating legal problem, sad in a way. If you ethnically cleanse 600,000 people and run them out of the country, does that show intent to destroy? Or does it merely show that you move them away and cleanse them? So I guess the point that I would take is that we can't we can't hope for too much from the Genocide Convention. We can't, if you look to the convention as a solution, it's not going to be found. And perhaps to try to end this on an optimistic note, I tried to say, well, perhaps a new US administration can apply other types of influence to the situation in Myanmar to achieve some goals there, and achieve some protection of rights in Myanmar without using these legal mechanisms that don't seem so well suited for that.
Yeah. So this is a question from our Ben Arroyo postdoc, Smanar Benatan, and she asks, what are the stakes for Gambia in the Myanmar case? Why has it taken such a leading role?
That's a good question. And, you know, I'm fascinated when a country like the Gambia, which is the full name, can run this case to the International Criminal Court. There's been a few cases like that. The Georgia cases got before the court based on racial discrimination. And so I have to say, I admire a country like the Gambia that recognizes the problem. And really, so what do we get from an ICJ ruling like this? Well, at a minimum, we show some light on this terrible situation. Right. And so I think that the positive consequences of this are now we have some worldwide recognition in the International Criminal Court, and some publicity that the victims may not otherwise have. So I think that that the Gambia is doing a positive service towards human rights in a court where it may not be, it may be a losing battle to hope to stop through that. But I mean, the publicity aspects of this could be very positive, and I admire that, despite the fact my colleague William Chavez is defending it on the other side.
Yeah. Okay, so this question is from Amber Nicole Terrell. Just thank you for your presentation. My question is related to the US's lack of response to this crisis. To what degree do you think that the US is not party to the ICJ that complicated our response? If we won't militarily intervene, what would a new administration do to help the Rohingya?
Sure. And I think so. The US is not a party to the International Criminal Court. And that's true. So I had one slide on the International Criminal Court. I think charges or convictions in the ICC are unlikely. And we've talked about the ICJ case, which with both the Gambia and Myanmar are parties to that. That's what brings that into court. So what can the US do? I think the US has not taken an active role in this. I'm optimistic about what a new administration could do, meeting with the leaders, using diplomatic and perhaps economic means to deal with this, despite the fact that China is engaged here. I mean, I think there may be some diplomatic opportunities. I think the chances of the US Marines landing in Cox's Bazar to deal with that horrible, that's not going to happen. But there may be other means of diplomatic and perhaps economic sanctions or other issues that I'm hoping the U.S. in the next administration engages more in problems of this kind. And so there may be some hope.
Yeah. So I think this is another student from my class, Sharon Keener Reynolds, asks about the history of racism against the Rohingya Muslims. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh my, I'm not an expert on that. In fact, you know, we have a professor at UW. Maybe we should have brought her. Mary Callahan has spent time in Myanmar, and you can take a course. You Jackson School students out there, if you can get if you want more on Myanmar, go to Mary Callahan's course because she's lived there and she knows more on this. But as a non-expert, I'd say there's dozens of persecuted ethnic minorities in that country, massive human rights violations. And I think that the Rohingya Muslims have stood out because of the level of violence. But Myanmar is a complex, fascinating society. Maybe you can find Mary Callahan's course to learn more about it.
Great. Okay, I'm going to take this first question, and I'm happy to answer it. I'm also happy for you to help me answer it. This is from an audience member named Lori. They ask, how do we understand the corruption or violence in Myanmar in terms of our Western understanding of Buddhism as a spiritual, peaceful tradition? right? So as a religion scholar, I'm happy to answer that. But if you want to start, go ahead.
Let me just see, as not a religion scholar, you know, and what little I know about Buddhism, peaceful, and then I see reports of mobs of Buddhists burning villages, and I can't make that connection. Can you make any connection there?
I said religion is just one factor in people's identity. It doesn't expect the totality of their actions, right? I mean, Christianity is peaceful, Islam is peaceful, Jews are peaceful, right? All the religious traditions, I think, can be described as peaceful, but religious ideals are never the sum explanations of the way people behave, right? So yeah, we can't look to like one part of people's identity to explain the totality of their actions. And I'm sure that's true in Myanmar as well. You're making me realize I need to study this part of the world more. But I think in any country, when you have 124 ethnicities, that there's kind of a precarious sense of nation state identity. I think that makes it likely that a group will be singled out as other, right? And they don't have to, I think, do much to be singled out. And actually, this was a question from students in the course as well. Can you tell us more about the original, you described the original action by the Rohingya as like one band of militants that attacked the government. Can you say a little bit more about the precipitating actions and why your colleague might describe it as an insurgency?
Sure. And I don't know that report. I have not read that report. I think it's available online that I cited, and it gives a description. Clearly, there were bands of Rohingya-based freedom fighters. They would probably identify themselves as that, and they with just a massive retaliation in terms of their numbers, in terms of the violence that was against the government. It occurred, but to what degree it occurred and whether the response was proportionate, I think clearly the report would indicate even Aung San Suu Kyi agreed that the response was at times disproportionate, and it was used as a reason to incite violence and to expel these people from the country. It was a very sad situation.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 students asked this, and I see Kendrick in the audience asked this as well, about the role of social media, right? So should social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter's administration be monitoring and removing content regarding violence, or would that role fall to the leadership involved in the event in question? Should it be curated at all, right? So what's the level of accountability we should apply to social media platforms like Facebook?
Sure. Yeah. Very complex question, and it's relatively new, so should Facebook monitor the content and remove vicious calls to violence? Yes. How do they do that? And now, international law. So to some extent, we're having difficulty enough in our own country in managing false and misleading information. There's one thing about talking about an election, and there's one thing about calling to kill certain groups. And under Bangladesh or under Myanmar law, that to what extent is Myanmar going to enforce rules in terms of regulating content in Myanmar? It just seems unlikely. And it's one of the unintended consequences. It doesn't seem that long ago when the internet was developed as a way to connect people and free people. And when I've been to places now, I'm just wondering, the net result seems to be bad in terms of the availability of social media for bad purposes.
Yeah, before this webinar started, you and I were talking about the importance of bringing in data scientists into, policy studies and, humanities. And I think this is a really interesting example, right, where our technological abilities have advanced beyond our abilities to sort of treat each other ethically, or to think about the way that social media tools can be used in a really unethical manner. And so, yeah, that's something students, I think, need to think about, the interface of these two. And
it's a problem that I didn't have to deal with when I was in college. So this is something that the students out there now are going to have to figure this out. How do you deal with it? It's a problem that has to be dealt with. How do you do that?
Yeah, very good question. So speaking of outdated issues, I guess Kataki asked about the Genocide Convention's definition. I mean, he asked if the convention's definition of genocide was specifically written for an event like the Holocaust, and really, is that what really limits its application to what we see going on today?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, when Lemkin wrote his book and he contributed to the definition of genocide, he was clearly looking to, I think he was looking to confirm something that was already out there. Clearly, the Nazis fit this definition, and it was so prevalent. And through their writings and their communications, it was obvious that it was intent to destroy a group. So Lemkin correctly moved on to create and to establish a crime and a convention that would prohibit it. And so that was a good thing. And it does, you know, when you look at other laws, such as the human rights conventions that seem to have very general terms, the compared to other general human rights exhortations, the Genocide Convention is really specific. And I guess that's a good thing to make it, because it was designed to deal with a unique problem, but still it hasn't fulfilled the promise that in Lemkin's view, and those people just after the Holocaust, this law, this convention hasn't quite achieved what it was designed to do.
Okay, so actually I'm gonna go back to a question from Patricia. She asked about the responsibility of the female of the president, who, I mean, you've been talking about, right? It's really the junta in some ways or the military is still in control of what's happening on the ground in Myanmar, right? And to some extent, I think the president is trying to maintain her own position. Do you have any more insight on what's happening there and her culpability?
Boy, that's a good, I'll bet you can find a number of research sources on that. And I'm unable to do that at this time, but obviously if you want to do more research into crimes and look more internally at Myanmar, maybe we can find some writings of our own, of Mary Callahan from the Jackson School, and could give some insight on that. She's in a way, she seems to be trapped there, and she really brought civilian rule to the country, but now she seems to be on the wrong side. And what factors are driving that? Is it better to have her there apparently condoning these things, or should she, if she condemns the acts of the military, how long will she remain there in power? So it's a sort of a tragic situation from what I can tell. Yeah. And I recommend the students who really want to know more about that. There's a lot of material out there for further research.
Yeah, so speaking kind of resources for students, but also for the general public, where would you suggest going to find good information about what's happening in Myanmar? Yeah. I guess online, because that's the world we're living in, but.
I know. In fact, you know, I don't know whether you can communicate. I'd be happy to do a little bit of a further lookup with some good, when I tell my students, you got to be careful what you do just rolling around on Google and what you can find. There's reputable sources. And I think that I'd be happy to maybe send an email back that you can distribute that would say, I could give 3 or 4 sources that either articles that can contribute to this, and I'd be happy to do that. I think Chavez's book is worth a look in terms of the legal aspects of this. He's fascinating look at the concept of the so-called genocide mystique. But I can find some other sources, alternative sources. I'd be happy to send.
Yeah, we often share kind of a reading list with the people who registered for the course, so that would be great.
Oh, good. I'd be happy to do that.
I will say the way that you introduced your colleague Chavez, I mean, I feel like he sort of is representing the reason people don't trust lawyers, right? He seems to have the right answers, but he's taken up defense of a regime that he also seems to admit has committed crimes. So I guess I'm not seeing enough alignment between the ethics that should be guiding.
Yeah, lawyers' ethics, you know, I think I believe, and they taught us in law school, that every client is entitled to a reasonable and legal presentation. You don't have to necessarily, and guilty people are entitled to a legal presentation. And that's never been a problem for me when I defended cases back early in my career. And so, so Chavez is, and I guess I respect him because he's willing to do that despite criticism. He was also, if you do a little research on Chavez, he was part of the UN Commission investigating the Israeli attacks on Gaza about 10 years ago, and he took huge criticism for that, and ultimately was getting personal threats because of his efforts to wade in and find out what the facts were. So Chavez is a unique gent, but I'd be happy to provide more sources that you could send out to your mailing list.
Yeah. So, okay, I guess last question, since we've had you for longer than the Q&A for most speakers, but this is it's very dangerous to talk about current events, because we don't have a lot of perspective yet. But the solution I hear you recommending, right, in case you're wondering like what to take forward, is that you're hoping that a new administration will combine economic sanctions, right, and that and more international cooperation around these sanctions, right? Because if China is involved, this is going to be complex. But like that's where you see promising action moving forward for people of Myanmar or for the Rohingya people.
I think so. Since I've already discouraged everybody and told them that the courts are not likely to do it, the U.S. Marines are not likely to bring a solution here. I think some international efforts to deal with the problem, to apply pressure, to find out more on the facts, apply pressure to deal with the problem. How do you deal with 500,000 people displaced without passports in Bangladesh? Humanitarian aid. I mean, there could be humanitarian programs that could be focused on that. So I think there's a number of humanitarian, diplomatic, economic efforts to deal with the victims who are already, most of them, out of the country, and to get the countries to properly respond. I think that would be my basic recommendation, and the hopes for perhaps a new U.S. administration.
Well, thank you so much for telling us about this region of the world and bringing Myanmar into the conversation. And it was really important to us when we were planning this course that we did bring in the comparative context. And so thank you for allowing us to do that.
Well, thanks for inviting me.